Mr. President, I want to talk tonight about a once-in-a-generation opportunity we have in this Senate tonight to help middle-class families, to help grow our economy, and I'm going to talk about the facts. I'm not going to be making stuff up. I'm going to talk about the real middle-class tax cuts that are in this legislation. I'm going to show you charts that indicate not just what kind of tax relief is going to be there for you and your family, but who's going to pay, where the burden is. And despite what you're hearing on the floor tonight from some on the other side of the aisle, the burden of taxation actually increases in this tax bill for the wealthiest Americans. And in terms of defending the status quo, which is a situation now where jobs and investment are going overseas, I think it is an outrage that this body has sat and watched company after company go overseas because of our tax code, and to say we shouldn't fix it, I don't get that. If we don't lower the rate on businesses and workers who are competing every day when you have the highest rate in the industrialized world, and you have an international system that rewards revenues being kept overseas, $2.5 to $3 trillion of earnings overseas instead of bringing them back, that status quo is not acceptable. So we can engage in all kinds of rhetoric here tonight, but if we stick to the facts, I think we might be able to see why this legislation is not only going to pass tonight, but why so many Americans who are struggling because they are living paycheck to paycheck are going to be happy with this legislation. The proof's in the paycheck. People say the proof's in the pudding. The proof's in the paycheck. When people see their withholding changing, less money being taken out of their paychecks for taxes, when they see that they've got a little more take-home pay, that the family budget's a little healthier, when they see the economy begin to take off, and when they see the end of this exodus of U.S. companies going overseas, 4,700, think of that number, 4,700 American companies have left our shores and gone overseas, being bought by foreign companies in the last 13 years that would not have gone if this tax code that we're promoting tonight had been in place. That's based on an Ernst & Young study. Check it out, Ernst & Young, it's a big accounting firm. 4,700 companies. And when they leave our shores, guess what? They take their jobs and investments with them. You might wonder why wages have been flat in this country for the past couple decades. It's because people who are supporting the status quo and don't want to change this tax code are leaving workers in America with no opportunities to get ahead. Because not only are wages flat, but expenses are up. That's called the middle class squeeze. It is very real, and it is happening. So I would just ask folks, when they're thinking about what you're hearing tonight on the floor, remember, one side supporting the status quo, and the status quo is not working. It ain't working for people in America and people in my state of Ohio who tell me, Rob, I'm working hard, I'm playing by the rules, I'm not getting ahead. And the statistics bear that out. Yes, some people are getting ahead, but it's not the guy or the woman working on the shop floor in a factory in Cleveland, Ohio, or Columbus, or Toledo, or Dayton, or Cincinnati, because their wages have been pretty darn flat. And again, their expenses are up, especially health care, which is the largest single one of those expenses. They want some help, and this legislation gives them that help in two ways. One, real middle-class tax cuts, we'll talk about in a second, and second, letting them be competitive instead of competing with one hand tied behind their back, because they are competing in a global economy, and they know that. Give them a chance. Give them a tax code that actually is up to date and competitive and lets them have the opportunity to build a better life, not just for themselves, but for their kids and their grandkids, because that's what they really care about. So again, Mr. President, I'm happy to talk about that opportunity we've got tonight. And it is a rare opportunity because we have not reformed this tax code in any substantial way in 31 years. Think about that. I celebrated my 62nd birthday today. That means We have not reformed the tax code in 31 years. That's half of my life. By the way, 31 years ago, Ronald Reagan was president. Pete Rose was still playing for the Cincinnati Reds. Top Gun was at all the box offices. It was a big hit. That's how long ago that was. And during that time, I will tell you, every other country that we compete with, all of them have reformed their tax code except us. We have sat back and had this debate. We've had this gridlock, partisan gridlock here in Washington because we can't get our act together. And by the way, if you're a worker trying to get ahead, you can't do it on your own because the tax code has you competing with that one hand tied behind your back. Only this place, Washington, Congress, a president can propose, develop, and sign legislation that can help to address this problem. This is our job. I sure hope we'll do it. Back in 1986, when that tax reform was passed 31 years ago, it led to two things. One, more economic growth. In the 1980s and the 1990s, we did have economic growth. 3.5%, 4%, even 4.5% growth. I mean, think about that. We're now living over the last 10 years with growth on average at about 1.5 to 2%. That's a big, big difference. Second thing it did is it got wages up. Wages actually increased during that period after that tax reform. We need to do it again. Our economy needs a shot in the arm again. Again, not just to improve the economy, but to improve take-home pay. And that's what this tax reform proposal is designed to do. We've heard on the other side of the aisle how this has moved too quickly. Somehow there hasn't been enough thought put into this. I will just tell you, I think it's long overdue. I think we should have done this years ago. I also know from being involved in these issues over the past couple of decades on the House Ways and Means Committee and now here in the Senate Finance Committee that there's been a lot of thought put into this issue. Just since I was elected to the Senate in 2010, there have been 70 hearings on this in the Finance Committee. 70 hearings on tax reform. Chairman Hatch is in the chamber tonight. He will tell you, 2 years ago we had 5 bipartisan working groups covering every part of the tax code. The bipartisan working group that I co-chaired with Democratic leader Chuck Schumer focused on the international side. You know what we decided? We decided we've got to have a lower business rate because it's got to be competitive, otherwise we'll continue to lose jobs and investment overseas. And we decided we have to have an international system that is competitive and bring back some of that $2.5 to $3 trillion that's stuck overseas back to this country for more jobs and investment. Guess what? It was bipartisan then, and it's in the tax bill now. Those are the ideas that are in this tax bill before us, and they make sense. In fact, for years there's been a bipartisan agreement that our tax code is broken, and it's Congress's responsibility to fix it. I'd like to commend tonight Speaker Ryan, Leader McConnell, Finance Chairman Orrin Hatch, who's here on the floor, Ways and Means Committee Chairman Kevin Brady, who's been a strong and fair negotiating partner with the Senate. I also want to thank my colleagues who have spent so many hours in this effort. Senator Toomey, you heard a little while ago, talking about the economic benefits, as he does so well. Senator Scott, Thune, Cornyn, Enzi, Murkowski, all on the conference committee, but many others too. Senator Collins, Johnson, Rubio, Corker, who all helped us get to this point and improve the legislation. The bill that passed the House earlier today, and we're going to vote on tonight, is the result of years and years of research and debate. It makes good on the promise we have made to create a tax code that provides tax relief to hardworking families, but also positions America for leadership in the 21st century global economy. While we've seen some improvements in the economy recently, we've seen some better economic growth numbers. Again, a lot of people I represent are not seeing the benefit of that. That's why we've got to pass this bill. For years, colleagues on both sides of the aisle have called for middle-class tax cuts to help ease the burden. This legislation will finally actually deliver that middle-class tax relief. We have the opportunity to provide it tonight. And starting January 1st, less than 2 weeks from tonight, that tax relief goes into effect. People are going to see how this tax reform helps them as soon as the IRS can adjust withholding and paychecks, which I would hope would happen before the end of February. Again, proof's in the pudding, proof's in the paycheck. People are going to see it. People can go online now and see. They can use a tax calculator and see how it's going to affect them and their families. But this is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon if we pass this legislation tonight. Again, the most immediate benefit is for working families and for the middle class. This bill doubles the child tax credit. It also increases the refundability of the child tax credit. So for those families with kids out there, you have the opportunity now to save a little more money to deal with the expenses of raising a child. It doubles the standard deduction from $12,000 for a family to about $24,000 per family. This, in effect, creates a $24,000 zero bracket for families, zero income tax bracket, and simplifies the tax code. Probably 90 to 95% of Americans are going to take that doubling of the standard deduction, I'm told, and that will simplify their returns, but also give them some tax relief right away. And it lowers tax rates for families across the board, with the largest proportional benefit going to those at the lower end of the income ladder, those who need it the most. In fact, the combination of these tax cuts for lower-income Americans means that at least 3 million Americans who have income tax liability now are going to pay nothing in taxes. They'll be off the tax rolls altogether. I have a letter from the Joint Committee on Taxation that affirms that. You can see at our meeting last week of the conference where the Joint Committee affirmed that again. Over 3 million people are going to pay no income taxes at all who pay income tax now. For those who say there's no benefit there, talk to those 3 million people. They feel the benefit. In fact, those people are going to be off the tax rolls altogether because of the tax relief we're passing tonight. As this chart shows, every income group will receive a tax cut. This one is for the year 2019. So it's a year after the tax cuts are put in place, which starts in just a couple weeks. We've heard a lot from opponents at the top end, those making $1 million or more, as we just heard a little while ago, get all the benefits. It's simply not true. This shows that the biggest percentage cut is among folks making between $20,000 and $30,000 a year. That's the biggest, 16.3% cut. It also shows that the smallest percentage cut is among those making $1 million or more, 5.9% cut. So again, yeah, there's tax relief across the board here, but the bigger benefit is among folks at the lower end of the economic scale. In fact, when you look at who pays the income tax, you'll see that those at the top are going to pay a slightly bigger share of the tax burden under this bill. Today, those making between $20,000 and $50,000 a year pay 4.3% of the income taxes. Under this bill, they're going to pay a little less, 4.1% of the income taxes. Those who make over $100,000 will go from paying 78.7% of the tax burden to 79.1% of the tax burden. So if you make over $100,000 a year, you're paying 78.7% of the tax burden today, that group is, and that's going to go up. Your share of the burden is going to go up. So the tax code's pretty progressive right now, and it gets even more progressive under this tax legislation. These are not my numbers. These are the numbers from the Joint Committee on Taxation, the nonpartisan group that scores these things. Check out the numbers yourself. Go on the website of the Joint Committee, jct.gov. Check it out. When you don't consider not choosing to buy health care insurance a tax increase, which is how the Joint Committee on Taxation scores ending the individual mandate, every income group of taxpayers gets a tax cut under this plan every year for the next 8 years during the time at which this tax cut is in place. And yeah, it does expire, as did the tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. Congress took those up, and for 95% of Americans, we extended that tax relief. I hope we'll do that again, and I expect we will. But during these next 8 years, this is real tax relief, and it's needed. I reject the premise that choosing not to buy health care insurance under the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate is somehow a tax hike, and I think most Americans do too. Take a look at the Rules Committee website, rules.house.gov, and you'll see how a typical family of four at the median income level will save more than $2,000 a year on their taxes as a result of this plan. So the median income family in Ohio, in your state, wherever you are, is going to be saving more than $2,000 a year on their taxes. Now, some have told me as I walk down the halls here, well, that's not much money. Well, you know what? For families that are living paycheck to paycheck, that is a lot of money, and it does help. It can be used to pay for health care, buy gas, buy groceries, maybe add a little more to your retirement. Of course, beyond the middle-class tax cuts that are in this legislation, families and workers are going to benefit from more jobs and higher wages, as we talked about earlier. And this is going to be because there will be new investment. There will be more productivity, which is a thing that's really lacking in our economy right now. Our productivity is weak. All the economists agree on this, right, left, or center. You got to do something to boost that productivity, because that's going to result in higher wages. More competition for workers is going to result in higher wages. And that's going to happen because this tax code is focused on increasing wages through more investment. We've talked about how companies are going overseas now and how the status quo isn't working. It's crazy that Congress allows that to happen, and fixing it's long overdue. We've talked about the $2.5 to $3 trillion that's stuck overseas right now. We want to bring that home. We want to add more jobs and investment in this country. We did a study in the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, a bipartisan effort, and we studied these companies that go overseas through what's called inversions or by being purchased by a foreign company. What happens? Do they just move their headquarters overseas? No. We found out they also move jobs and investment. This is real. It's happening now. We can fix it. That's what this bill is intended to do, and I believe you're going to see not just middle-class tax relief to help with the take-home pay and the family budget, but you're going to see this increase finally, not just in economic growth, but in wages. That also makes the family budget a whole lot more healthy. I see Senator Cassidy's just come on the floor. Let me address an issue that's been misrepresented on the floor this afternoon. I heard one of my colleagues say, and this bill gets rid of the historic tax credit. It does not. Thanks to the efforts of some of us who strongly support it, including Senator Cassidy, we actually retain the current 20% credit in the Senate-passed bill and in the final legislation. And by the way, this historic tax credit's been very helpful. It's been instrumental in generating more private funds to restore historic buildings across my state of Ohio, including in my hometown of Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, elsewhere. We also preserved important tax credits for urban redevelopment through the New Markets Tax Credit and the private activity bonds, which are still in this legislation, just as they are in current law. In Ohio, again, these tax incentives have leveraged a lot more private sector dollars, spurred economic growth, job creation, affordable housing, and I think have ultimately increased the tax revenue, because as people are working, as you get these buildings up and going, economic growth is generated, and so is tax revenue. They pay for themselves, in my view. I shared some of those success stories in my home state throughout this process, and again, we successfully maintained those provisions in our final bill. The final result is we've got a good tax reform bill that achieves the things that Republicans and Democrats alike have long supported: tax cuts for the middle class and a more competitive tax code for American workers and companies. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle tonight have talked about this being bad for the deficit. I just got to tell you, I respectfully disagree. The most important thing we can do right now to get the deficit down is to get this growth back, because economic growth results in more revenue. 1 point in economic growth alone brings $2.7 trillion more in revenue into the coffers of the federal government. That's based on the numbers from the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. Think about that. $2.7 trillion more with just 1 point of economic growth. The budget score we were forced to use for this legislation estimates a very conservative level of economic growth at a weak 1.9% over the next 10 years. That was the last 10 years. We don't want to repeat that. We don't have to repeat that. The average economic growth over the past 30 years has been more than 2.5%. And over the last 2 quarters, we've had economic growth of 3.1% and 3.3%. The Federal Reserve and private forecasts are both above CBO's growth projections for next year, as an example to show you why I think CBO's numbers are way too small, too weak. That 1.9% growth is not only wrong, I believe it's unacceptable. It can't be the new normal. With the strength of our economy right now, paired with the pro-growth changes in this tax reform plan, I believe economic growth will surpass this relatively low projection we're forced to use. And by increasing economic growth at just 0.4% more than this 1.9%, this weak projection, so growing the economy at about 2.3% rather than 1.9% on average, there's sufficient revenue to pay for all the tax relief in this plan, plus begin to pay down the debt. That's what I believe will happen. If you do the right kind of tax reform, it has to be the right kind, it has to be pro-growth, and I believe what we've done in this bill is exactly that. There's no question we're going to have more economic growth, more investment in America. The current tax code is so broken, it's pretty easy to do that, honestly, to create a more efficient and effective and productive tax code. I believe a more confident America with rising wages and stronger economic growth, by the way, is much more likely to address the very real fiscal challenges we face as a country. This tax reform bill isn't just about dollar amounts and bottom lines, though. It's about an investment we are making in American families, American workers, American businesses. We're giving families the freedom to spend more of their own money, how they see fit, putting faith in American entrepreneurs and workers to compete and win in the global market, and creating a fairer tax system that levels the playing field and creates jobs and investment here in America rather than overseas. Our constituents deserve this. They deserve better than the status quo, and they deserve more than just hollow promises. They deserve a brighter future. I believe the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will reopen our economy as the best place in the world to do business and create that brighter future for all Americans.